And good morning again. Okay, so for the first hour or so, first half hour, we spoke about what I would do as Prime Minister on the particular issue that stands before our country at the moment. And I took it fairly slow. I don't want to rush these things. Okay, there's another issue that our country has, and that's the issue of the incredible cost of housing. Now, there's that housing in Auckland, that houses in Auckland, the average house price is over $1 million, excludes so many young people from ever owning a home. And how ridiculous is it that in a country of just 5 million people, with vast areas of land and vast amounts of building materials, as far as timber is concerned, that timber costs an absolute arm and a leg. It's ridiculous. You go for a tiny piece of timber at even at Bunnings or at Mitre 10, and the cost of timber there is just through the roof. You think, what's happening to our timber? I mean, I've got a son-in-law who's in the bush, who cuts timber down. China has more or less put a halt on importing logs, which was where most of our timber went. You'd think surely New Zealand can manufacture, treat the timber used for housing. So raw materials cost an arm and a leg, cost an absolute fortune. Finding sections to build on. Look at the area we have here in New Zealand. Finding a section, the price of a section in Auckland compares to the price of a house at least a year or two ago in different parts of Texas. When you take a look at some of the shows that they had in Texas, the doer-uppers, and some of those houses are quite nice that are doer-uppers. Big house, reasonable size section, and I remember one where the price of the house was and section was about $150,000 US. House and section. And they said, yeah, another 80,000 and we'll have this done up. In other words, they end up with something with a house costing around about 230,000 US dollars. And if one New Zealand dollar is around about 70 cents, you divide the 230,000 by 0.7, and you're looking at around 330,000 New Zealand dollars. 330,000 New Zealand dollars, and you've got a very nice large house on a reasonable size section. They can do that in the States. You say, well, of course they can do that in the States because they've got such a whopping great population, and they've got all the mills and so on, and their building materials are way lower than ours. Now, I realize the building materials over there also have skyrocketed, and that's something else we need to look into. But nonetheless, imagine that now they could have got that doer-upper, not for 330,000, let's bump that up another half. You're looking at about $500,000 in the States. While here in New Zealand, and we're talking New Zealand dollars now, well, here in New Zealand, It's twice as much. And we don't earn as much as those in the States either, on average. Well, there's a number of issues here. The first one is building materials. So what would I do as your Prime Minister? Well, I would have I'd create a partnership where we have the government not subsidizing, going in as partner into manufacturing the building materials that we use in houses: plywood, cladding, flooring, the beams, all of those things. But getting the plants up and running and sufficient so that we have sufficient building materials at a decent price. I remember a few years back we had just 3 major fuel suppliers: Mobil, Shell. Yeah, there were maybe 3 or 4. Caltex. You could go through. And then restrictions were loosened. And New Zealand companies could set up the outlets for them. What happened? The price of fuel dropped per litre. It dropped probably, I think it was by 10 cents. We were under $1 per litre. And so it dropped maybe 12 or 13, maybe 15, as much as 15% at that time. In other words, what had been happening was that the major fuel companies had a monopoly. And even though it mightn't have been a verbal agreement between them, they fed off one another, and they were extracting from the New Zealand public prices that just were ridiculous. Well, we may be in a similar situation here as far as building is concerned. And our current government and the previous government, they're all very similar. Really didn't care about the New Zealand public. And being a member of the New Zealand public, I do care. And as your Prime Minister, just making things up here though, as your Prime Minister, I would make sure that since we've got such a vast supply of timber, that we would also have the wherewithal to turn that into building materials that didn't cost as much. In other words, we'd create, if necessary, more outlets for that, for the timber, where the builders can, and the ordinary New Zealander can buy the timber at way, way less than what it costs. So the building materials are one thing. Okay. The next thing is sections. Why are sections so way high in price? And I would say it's because we are telling people, as a government, we're telling them what they can and can't do with their land. Now, when I was in Colorado, and going from the airport into Denver, and then out to Parker and further out again to Little Rock, to Colorado Springs, you know, that you can take a look out and you'll see these circular, you'll see a road going to a to a place where there's a circular fence around, and it's a vast circular fence around several hundred houses, almost a village, if you like, maybe 500 houses. And within that village, I've not been to those circular ones, but I thought, what a good idea. You have small sections. You have, they might be called cookie cutter homes, maybe 5 different kinds of homes. And every you go through 5 and then it starts again, the same one that was previous. So the homes don't look identical, but there's only 5 different kinds of homes, and they're big homes on small sections. And I thought, what a great idea. So here's what I would suggest as a Prime Minister, is that we offer an incentive to some of our farmers. Say, look, we will build a road through and we'll take a small area of your farm, we'll put a fence right around it so that it's self-contained, and we're going to have small sections. They can have their own set of shops. They also had their own set of shops over in the States. But a lot of homes in a small space and out of sight of the main road, because so that when people drive through our New Zealand countryside, they still see the rolling green hills. It's not going to be an eyesore. But we could alleviate the section shortage very, very quickly. There's also areas that that our councils have that I would call common land. It belongs to all of us. In fact, most of New Zealand belongs to all of us. It's not state-owned. It's owned by us, the New Zealanders. But there are areas I would call common land. You have commons in England, and you used to have people putting up little abodes there because they owned nothing and couldn't afford anything. Well, nowadays that's all regulated. But what we need here in New Zealand is not a starting point of buying a house for $250,000 or $300,000 way out in the sticks and where there's no work. No, we need a starting point where people can enter at a with a tiny home and don't actually have to pay for land at all. What do I mean by that? Or pay the minimal amount. Well, there are these places that we could call common lands. And what needs to happen, in my view, is that we say, okay, well, here's a common land, and here's little plots that you could put on a tiny home, and you can buy a tiny home for 40 or 50,000. And you could link it up to the and what you do is you have you set up the commons with a water tank, or to the water mains and the local sewage system, or you create a sewage system for all of those tiny homes. And the tiny home has a tiny kitchen and a bathroom and maybe a 1-bedroom. So that couples who are just getting married, they can go to those common lands. They can say, okay, I'm going to build a tiny home on this lot. I know that the piece of land will never be mine. That's okay. But I can move the tiny home if I want to a different place, or I can sell it after I've done. So the tiny home is my what's costing me money, and for 80,000 I can be in a home, and we could do it very easily at what used to be we used to be able to do back in my parents' day. A state advances loan at 3% for a mortgage, and you can then stay in that tiny home as long as you like. If you're starting to have kids, the next step might be to go to or to add on to the tiny home if there's room, or go to another place where there's a little bit more room to spread. And then you've got an entry point, not at 300,000, but at perhaps 80,000, and that should be affordable to almost anybody if we allow them to get the mortgage for that, you see. So they and it wouldn't be money given to them, it would be money given to the builder of the tiny home, so that the mortgage is on something concrete, and they can stay there as a single or married couple, and as I say, as the family grows, they can move into, and so what we have is we have a scale of homes starting at, as I say, the bottom end, 80,000. Yes, they don't own the land, but they do have a small enough home to be able to live for a year or two. And let's think about that. If you've got a tiny home, and you've got a mortgage for 80,000 at 3%, you're paying $2,400 a year. Now, $50 a week. $50 a week is $2,500 in a year. Imagine that the mortgage, or the rent, if you like, instead of being typically $600 or $700 in Auckland, or $400 or $500 in smaller centres, suddenly drops to 1/10 of that. Well, okay, it'll be more than that. Add another 50. Instead of being, say, 500, it's 100, because you're paying back principal as well as interest. And the aim is for you to go to a larger home later on. It gives everybody more money for other things. What else does it do? It means that we don't have vast amounts of money disappearing off the shores of New Zealand, particularly if this is offered by, say, Kiwibank, the New Zealand-owned bank, or Bank of Taranaki. You know, if we can keep it in New Zealand, the interest on these lines, if we can keep that in New Zealand, then it helps the New Zealand economy. It's not disappearing into Australian banks, which are owned probably by some of the richest people and families in the world that have got way too much influence. Anyway, so yeah, that's so we've dealt to the shortage in building materials. We've looked at what we can do as far as common lands are concerned, so that people have an entry point to be able to come in and build homes. What else is needed? Well, I tell you what else is needed. We need to get away from building consents and council being involved in anything to do with building. That needs to be removed from the council. For one, is amazingly slow at giving consents. How dare they be so slow at giving consents when the rest of us are paying their way? Now, when something is being built, the building inspector has to come and check this and that and the other. All right, let's take that away from council and let's put that with the people who know what they're doing. In other words, the plumbers. We will have from the plumbing community, and not the same people, otherwise they become lazy in what they do. But from the plumbing community, they will keep an eye on their own what they do, and they'll have people that sign it off. So I would suggest this. In small town like Tirau or Rotorua, or those ones, that the plumbers and the builders and the electricians and the roofies, they have a loose connection of, in other words, once the job is done or the job is underway, they have someone else in that community sign it off. In other words, they're working together to make sure that things are safe. Now, what would that do? If we had something like the leaky home syndrome that we had back in the day, many homes, leaky homes, and the councils who had signed these things off didn't take responsibility for that. I think it was the government that stepped in to pay towards that, but they were blaming everybody but themselves. Well, imagine you've got something like that because of poor workmanship among any of these groups, these collectives. Then they would indeed be liable because they've done a shoddy job. So the collective themselves have a vested interest in making sure that what they do is safe. So they keep an eye on one another in that sense. They look after one another. They have although they have their own business, we have every year maybe one or two people from the collective that it's their time this year to go around and make sure things are looking right and looking good. Why can we do that? Well, the electricians already have that. They don't have the council come around and check that what they've done is right. They are liable themselves, and nobody's looking over their shoulder, but they make sure that they do the right job, because if something goes wrong and the house burns down, for example, they are liable if it's found that the job was not up to speed. Okay, so we keep the council out of the building thing entirely. Well, you say, who signs it off? Each of the ones that has built it signs it off. We can lodge the thing at council. There's nothing wrong with that. But let's keep the council out of any of the rest of it. Then you say, well, what about the regulations? How close they can build to the edge of the property, and if they're going to build something different, getting the neighbours' consent and stuff like that. Yeah, they can still do that. There's no reason why not. But we need to get away from having someone looking over the shoulders of these guys continually. In other words, we need to get rid of the leech organisations in our country. And this isn't just in building. That's another thing. There's so many, even in the teaching, I'd say, back in the day, when the schools themselves had the responsibility of choosing what teachers they had, it was at least as safe, because they did their homework, as having the teachers' council. Anyway, that's my own bugbear. Why have leech organisations at all? Why don't we get people to do into jobs that are actually going to be useful for the whole of New Zealand? Yeah. So where did we get to? Housing. Okay, so you know, because before people even started building, the consents to build cost an arm and a leg. The consent to build. And I would suggest that if if you have the plans for a house that have already been okayed at a different location, gone through all the engineering and the checkups, that in the new location, after checking that the soil is the right kind and so on, which is all got nothing to do with council, it's got to do with getting the soil specialists in. Pardon me. Once all that is done and they've signed it off, the engineering report, once that's done, they don't need permissions from council. It's their land, and it goes back to, I guess, the barons and the Magna Carta under King John. Back in those days, the king could confiscate anybody's land. He could do whatever he liked. And the barons and the king, of course, should there be a war looming, would go to the barons and say, I need your fighting men for the war. Well, one was looking like it could happen, but the barons said to King John when he requested these men, he said, no, we want you first to sign an agreement that our lands are our lands, that you cannot go and that these are for us to do with what we want. We have a right to our lands. And without interference from the king. And the king was reluctant to do anything, but because of the danger, he signed it. That really is the beginning of land rights. And in my view, the government and the councils have overstepped their authority as far as when you own a piece of land, that's your land. Government, council should have no say or have minimal say in what happens there. So yeah, we'd do away with a lot of those so-called permissions. Yes, you'd still need to get things signed off by people who know what they're doing. Of course you would. But that would also bring the price down of new housing. So, should there be a link up, a price to link up with sewage and water? I don't believe so. If the sewage and water mains are there, just link up and charge what everybody else is being charged. Why? Because the charge that is being charged by others, you add your amount, and that your amount also goes into maintaining the thing and upkeep. And yes, if it becomes too many, you will have to upgrade. But every time you get more people, there's more money pouring in. So there should be no link-up charge, in my view, whatsoever. It's hard enough for young people to get into housing. Let's not make it harder. Anyway, that's my view on what we should do about the housing situation. Common lands, less regulation. Building materials lowered. Keep the council, keep their nose right out of what's happening. Yes, still keep it safe because you've got your different groups doing what they need to do. And the price of housing would come down to a sensible place. The big reason why, of course, housing is so expensive here in New Zealand is because there's a shortage. One last thing. Education. Our children in school, we keep them seated at desks. And I've been in the education system for over 40 years. We keep them seated at a desk for 5 hours a day. Well, 4 hours a day probably. You take a look at the core subjects, maths and science, English, social studies. Most of the time they're sitting down. Totally unhealthy for young people. Have them sitting for a couple of hours, not a problem. Teach them to read and write. The writing is atrocious. Spelling is ridiculous. Comprehension, just not there for many students. What on earth are they doing sitting down at the desk most of the time? Their mathematical ability, they don't even know their times tables by and large. Maybe the top classes to some degree. Our education system isn't working. But that's something for another day. What I'm saying, though, is this. Our students need to be way more active, because as far as the trades are concerned, we've got far too few going into the trades. And that means that tradies are charging more for their services than teachers get. That never used to be the case. Teachers used to get $20, $30 more an hour than the tradies. Tradies would be around $35 an hour, and teachers be up at $55 an hour, something like that. It's all gone up, of course, but now the tradies are way, way above that. You take a look at, you get a builder in Auckland, or a plumber, or plumbers especially, but electricians, you know, they're charging themselves out at $100 an hour. Way high. Now, I don't have a problem with those guys at all, not at all. If you're a rare breed and the envy of a lot of us. But what I do have a problem with is kids sitting on their backsides for hours and hours on end. They're unfit. They are afraid of trying anything like using a hammer or you know, they get a tiny bit of the electricity thing in science, using batteries or rheostats or power packs, but really very few go on to become electricians, plumbers, builders, you know, drain layers. Very few are in the trades. And why? Because they don't know anything about it, and that's not their safe zone. Everything has become PC, where if it feels uncomfortable, just don't do it. We need to get away from that. We need to have our kids outside. We need to have them go on tramps, go camping, go outdoors, you know, building bivouacs, or you know, temporary shelters. Show them that they can do these things. Give them a love of the outdoors. Give them a love of being outside. And then we can get more that are interested in doing these things. More that are unafraid. But yeah, anyway, there it is. And that would also help bring down the price of some of these houses if we had a good number of people that are willing to go that direction. Anyway, I've had my say. That's the solution, or a possible solution, to the what I would call the building crisis that we have here in New Zealand, and the incredible cost if you're going to buy a house. Anyway, that brings me to the end of the stream, and we'll see you shortly for the next one. Have a good day.